It is a great honour to be asked to talk on this occasion when we celebrate 150 years of the great University of Keio. I am particularly happy to do so at this time, since my own University of Cambridge is celebrating its own past, the 800 years since its supposed founding in 1209. Thus, these two great universities are linked in their memories, and they are specifically linked by the founder of Keio, Fukuzawa Yukichi, whose portrait hangs in Downing College, Cambridge. Fukuzawa Yukichi was arguably the most important figure in the building of modern Japan. Thereby, he contributed to the whole of modern world civilization in a significant way. As I shall explain, for some years, and in an earlier book, half of which was on Fukuzawa's life and ideas, I had assumed that he mainly acted as a bridge between the West and the East. He certainly did this, but recent research and my own deepening understanding of Japan suggests that his work is more complex than this. It represents and illuminates the transformation of both Western and Japanese structures at a deep level. Fukuzawa did not reject his and Japan's past, but filtered Western ideas and institutions to fit in within the Japanese framework, thus continuing a tradition which had enabled Japan to retain its autonomy for over 1,000 years. Thus, what he helped to create at Keio University in particular, and more generally in Japan, is not just a copy of Western institutions, but something both new and with deep roots in Japanese traditions. It is something unique and special. Let me illustrate what I mean in relation to a number of themes or problems which faced Fukuzawa in his massive act of translation. Let us start with the auspicious year 1858. It was only 5 years since the black ships had appeared off Japan, but it was already clear to the young Fukuzawa that the new learning, which he had encountered in the school of Ogata Koan in Osaka, needed to be introduced as quickly as possible. At first, he thought that this required the learning of Dutch, and so he founded the school which would later be transformed into Keio University. Meanwhile, back on my side of the world, a young Cambridge-trained biologist was about to publish The Origin of Species, which would indirectly shape Fukuzawa's thought in an evolutionary and competitive survival of the fittest direction. The history of the subsequent 150 years since then can be seen as the working out of the mixture of these two worlds. I find it helpful, as a starting point, to think about what has happened in those 150 years in Japan, and to use a metaphor from silviculture, the art of tree cultivation, a field in which both the Japanese and the English excel in their own ways. Let us think of Fukuzawa's task, as he gradually came to know it, as that of a tree cultivator. He had been raised as one twig on an ancient tree whose roots went back thousands of years. The continuity of Japanese civilization over the 1,000 years before his birth was very strong. At the other end of the world, in England, there had grown up over the previous 1,000 years an equally continuous and evolving tree. Although there are some strange parallels in these two islands, they are also enormously different. What Fukuzawa set himself to do was to bring them together, to bridge or translate one into another. Japanese civilization was based on intense rice cultivation, using an immense amount of human labour. England's wealth was based on extensive cultivation, using animal power, wind, water, coal, and for a century or so before 1858, steam power. The Japanese had a highly commercialized and monetized economy and a rational and highly efficient productive system, much like the English. But the social relations of production were totally different, embedded and multi-stranded in the Japanese case, highly individualized and commoditized for many centuries. Japan had very high literacy rates, a huge market in books, great curiosity and sophistication in its had very high literacy rates, a huge market in books, great curiosity and sophistication in its literature. But it had nothing like the university system which had existed in England for over half a millennium and had already produced numerous world-class intellectuals. Japan was based on a political system which has been best described as centralized feudalism, with considerable distribution of power, but focusing on a powerful shogun and without any form of elected representation. In England, the oldest form of elective government in the Western world had survived, and by 1858 the suffrage had been widened, though many, and in particular women, were still without the vote. In Japan, there was a judge and precedent-based legal system, as Wigmore points out, the only one outside the Anglo-American tradition. But in many respects, the consensual, informal, but at times rough and arbitrary systems of law in Japan were at the polar extreme to those in England. One way of putting this was expressed precisely in 1858 at Trinity Hall, Cambridge. The young Sir Henry Maine was drafting his most famous book, Ancient Law, and highlighting the difference between the majority of legal systems based on status, birth position, and those based on contract. England was the furthest along the road to contract. Japan was, and still is, largely a legal system based on status. In Japan, there were many gods, but no God with a capital G. It was a complex mix of diverse traditions, animist, shamanic, Buddhist, and Neo-Confucian ethics. In England, 1400 years of Christianity had left a deep impression, moving the country towards a rather ascetic form of Protestant and Puritan monotheism, with a belief in one God, the identity of religion with ethics, and beliefs in sin and salvation. In Japan, the philosophical roots were pre-Confucian and neo-Confucian, and hence logic, ideas of explanation, of cause and effects, of negative and positive, or proofs, were very different from the West, where the influence of Greek, Roman, Arabic and medieval Christian thought had led to a different set of mental tools. Likewise, the languages could hardly be more different. Many things, such as personal pronouns, tenses, negative and positive discriminations, existed but had largely been avoided in Japanese. All were important in the somewhat blunt, positivistic and prosaic language of England. In Japan, as Fukuzawa amply illustrates in his autobiography, people were embedded and subjected to huge group pressures, both within the ie, or extended family, and in other groupings. In England, the individual was largely a separated, autonomous, and largely free entity, a molecule out of which the social system was built. In Japan, all relations were hierarchical or vertical, as Chinakane calls them. Older and younger, parents and children, men and women, upper samurai and lower samurai. Fukuzawa's anecdote about how, by changing his demeanour and language while walking down the road, he could make others swell or shrink like rubber dolls, illustrates this. England was a highly stratified class society, but as Tocqueville had noted, it had not gravitated towards caste. Wealth dominated in England, but even in gender, and certainly in age, relations were based on a deeper premise of equality before the law, before the state, and above all, before God. We could argue about the details of these contrasts between the two ancient trees which had grown up with little contact over the 1,000 years before 1858. We could note some surprising similarities as well in aesthetics, urbanism, and Puritanism. Yet the outstanding impression is that Fukuzawa's task in integrating the other from outside was immense. When I first read Fukuzawa's autobiography, his work on civilization, and other translated works, and learnt of what he had achieved in introducing accounting methods, weapons, Western books, methods of speech and debate, let alone schools and the university, I was immensely impressed. I wrote a book in which I took the general line that what Fukuzawa had done was to really understand the West through a combination of reading and analysing some of the best works available: Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, Robert Chambers, and Buckle, and through his shrewd observations during his 3 visits to the West. Once he had understood Western growth over the century, its history, structure, force and peculiar characteristics, I thought he had then imported it more or less as a complete system into Japan. In doing this, he had been forced to clear away the undergrowth of Japanese traditions, uprooting much of the past and planting in its place the new learning. Although I knew that Fukuzawa had reverted to, in his later life, to a stress on the Japanese way of things, dressing in traditional costume, living in a traditional house, occupied in traditional activities such as cutting wood, I rather unquestioningly took the idea of modernization theory and applied it to his own endeavour. I believed he had reinvented Japan as a modern nation. This was not just superficial, but at a deeper level. That is to say, he had understood that the West was based on a crucial separation of spheres, that the individual could be free and independent because the different spheres of life, religion, politics, economy and society, had been pulled and held apart. In this state, contract replaced status. The premise of equality was enshrined, and true liberty could flourish. This was roughly the picture I put forward in my essay on Fukuzawa, but it now seems to me to be only partially right. There are several reasons for doubting the total replacement or uprooting of one tree and planting another metaphor. Firstly, recent scholarship on Fukuzawa has suggested that his thought was far more complex and layered than this. He did not destroy the Neo-Confucian framework in which he was raised, but rather used it as a kind of embracing philosophy, a receptacle into which he fitted Western ideas, never dislodging it, but reinterpreting it. Extending the metaphor, he took the Neo-Confucian rootstock and grafted onto it the Western ideas, leaving quite a lot of Japanese growth, arts, customs, culture and language, and adding things like Western educational methods, modified gender and family relations, and Western economic and political ideas. In order to bring incompatible ideas into some kind of fusion, he had to reinterpret Western ideas. Let me give 3 examples. According to Professor Toshiko Nakamura, when Fukuzawa translated the phrase from a book published by Robert Chambers, he took the rather abstract phrase "good of society" and replaced it with communication with other people. According to Professor Nakamura, I quote, "It was the powerful forms of communication through language and transport which struck him about the West. He believed that Japan had the basis for a good civilization, but it could be improved by better communication. In fact, this change totally alters the meaning from a rather abstract, vaguely utilitarian and Christian concept to something much more limited and relational. A second example was when Fukuzawa translated Chambers' phrase marriage state as father-mother relations. He also inserted a phrase about how this institution was to look after children and helping each other. Professor Nakamura suggests that he was trying to argue that the feeling that father and mother must look after such children is the original human nature. It was the role of parents to do this. Thus he had not been aware of the fact that there is no automatic right of children to be looked after in England. End of quote. To this I would add that it completely alters what is, in England, the primary bond, which is lateral, between husband and wife, who become one flesh and one blood, to the vertical relationship, which has always been primary in Japan, where the strongest bond of the parents is with their children rather than with each other. In both cases, it has been assumed that Fukuzawa was unaware of how he was making a change during the translation. However, as further examples are gathered, we shall see to what extent this was a conscious decision to alter the incoming flow of ideas so that it reinforced rather than undermining the previous system. This was an ancient technique, and one which would be used by others in Fukuzawa's time. For example, in the well-known way in which imperial Shinto was constructed self-consciously as a kind of analogue to what was perceived to be religion in the West, but during the process distorting the meaning of the phenomenon. One way of looking at this process is in terms of inner and outer, as Professor Nakamura does in the following observation. I quote, "In Fukuzawa's thinking, Japanese family relations had to be kept whole. But outside the family circle, i.e. in the economic and political fields, Japan had to become as capitalist and liberal as the West. So we always have this double-layer social structure. The outer structure of society is Western, but the inner Japanese. We can see this double-layer structure in various combinations, in every aspect of social life in Japan." End of quote. In fact, I now think that it is more than the inner against the outer, the family world intact, but the outer Western. I suspect, as Professor Nakamura's last sentence implies, everything, including things like the economic, political, and legal fields also have their inner and outer sides. So it is immensely complex, as I try to describe in my book, Japan Through the Looking Glass. My reasons for feeling that I had seriously oversimplified Fukuzawa's approach are not just based on examining how Fukuzawa translated Western concepts. They also reflect what I have learned in the 12 years since I first wrote about him. My first interpretation that Fukuzawa had replaced one tree, Japanese, by another, Western modernity, was based on a superficial knowledge of Japan. I had been there for 3 short visits and talked in depth to several Japanese friends and read what I could in translation. As I spent more time in Japan, and particularly as I supervised a succession of Japanese PhD students, I became increasingly aware but that below the surface, Japan was far from fully Westernized. Having the opportunity to teach for 3 months in Tokyo University in the autumn of 1997 and living in a Japanese-style house in the suburbs revealed a great deal more. Then, making a television series in 1999, which took me into many unlikely places, including the speech hall at Keio University, further added to my growing awareness that perhaps I had not understood what had happened in Japan. I tried once again to write a book which would help me to understand Japan better. And it suddenly dawned on me in the summer of 2005, as I read and reread diaries of our visits, read Maruyama Maciel more carefully, and talked to my close friends, that I had missed the central point about Japan. This central point is that while grafting on new things, what happened in fact was that the rootstock had not been changed, and that what happened in the generation after 1858 was not a new response, but a repeat of what had happened in the 9th, 13th, and 16th centuries in Japan. I appreciated the meaning of Maruyama Maciel's metaphor, the basso ostinato, the reverberating deep note, which had remained through the centuries, and consequently, as Maruyama had realized, as he read and reread Fukuzawa, Japan had not become modern in the obvious sense. To revert to the other metaphor, the tree that grew upwards through time was a subtle mixture of several trees. I realized that Japan had somehow managed to avoid going through the huge turning points in its philosophical axis, or axial age revolution, which Max Weber had implicitly described and had been made explicit by the work of his pupil Karl Jasper. This axial age, stretching over the 500 years from about 800 to to 300 BC, had basically set the world on a new course. Before the axial age, the natural and supernatural worlds were entangled with each other. The world of spirits was largely a reflection of this world and mingled with it. Humans and animals, this life and the afterlife, were blended together. The divine world was not a separate ideal order against which we measured this life, but a continuation of the sensory world in an invisible form. For reasons as yet unexplained, a number of great religious and philosophical figures emerged who changed all this. This great separation was the revolution affected by Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, in the Upanishads and the teachings of the Buddha in India, of Zoroaster's teachings in Persia, in the major Old Testament prophets, including Elijah, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, in Homer, Heraclitus, and Plato in Greece. They created a dynamic tension between this world of matter and another of spirit. They set up ideals against which our behavior should be judged. New philosophical systems provided a reorganized relation between a God or ideal system and this corrupt world. I discovered such as Eisenstadt and Robert Bellah were also realizing that Japan alone of the great literate civilizations had not been through this axial transformation by 1858, so that the black ships which stood in the bay found a world where axiality had not occurred. It was an opposition between the axial and the non-axial. The two opposed worlds were as different as the shamanic world I had entered on my first fieldwork as an anthropologist in a Himalayan village in 1968, and the world from which I came in Great Britain. But the scale was massively greater. Fukuzawa's task was somehow to incorporate the new order of things, as huge an import as that of Chinese culture in the 8th century, yet without shattering this ancient inner mystery. And I believe he succeeded magnificently. So carefully and elegantly, indeed, was the grafting done, that I and many others in the West did not, for a long time, notice Fukuzawa's sleight of hand. It even deceived Maruyama for some years. For, using the kind of subtle adaptations which the Japanese had used so well in previous encounters in order to subvert all axial systems fundamentally, including Confucianism, Buddhism, and early Christian evangelizing, Fukuzawa managed to import what was useful and helpful without basically shaking the deeper, totally other logic. If this is the case, This has implications in all areas of Japanese-Western relations, for it is easy to be tricked into believing in too much similarity between the westernized surface of Japan and the West. In trying to understand Japanese economy, polity, religion, and society, we will treat them very differently if we accept that what Fukuzawa and others did was graft certain institutions onto a Japanese rootstock. This did not mean that Japan is hypocritical, or that Western ideas are superficial, or an external covering over a true and real inner self in Japan. But it does mean that as we encounter Japan, we will find constant reminders of an otherness, a patterned set of differences which do not grow weaker as the years pass. Let me give a few examples from my experience of PhD students in Cambridge. One concerns the relationship between supervisor and student. In the English tradition, this is a master-apprentice relationship. It is important for many, but it is just one out of a number of such relationships. The student will probably go away and work elsewhere, and may lose touch with his or her supervisor, as perhaps half of my 40 or so PhD students have done. Those that remain in touch become my equals, early on calling me by my first name and treating me more as a friend than as a formal teacher. From my own experience and talking to others, the sensei relationship is much deeper in Japan. The sensei remains a figure of great respect, is likely to help one to a job, may help in marriage and other family affairs, so is almost like a second father. Indeed, one of my colleagues refers to his supervisor still as my father in Nerima, and tells me that he will have a relationship of on, or obligation, as long as his supervisor lives. My Japanese students continue to write to me as sensei, and to treat me in a way which feels very different from that of my English or American students. All this fits within a continued verticality of relations, which has not changed into the lateral world of the West. The fact that sensei is a position of such high respect is shown by the fact that Fukuzawa is still considered to be the only true sensei at Keio University. The essence of the Cambridge PhD is that it should be an original contribution to knowledge. In other words, one should take a due account of what has already been done and known, but then discover something new. Many of my students from Japan or China have difficulty with this. In their educational inheritance from Confucianism, the idea is to remember and transmit the ideas of the predecessors, perhaps making very small amendments and adjustments, as in the craft of pottery or kabuki, but largely showing a deep understanding of an ancient way of doing things. I remember being most forcibly jolted into noting the difference when one of my Japanese students produced a number of chapters which, when examined, were full of just long quotations copied from leading authorities with hardly any additional commentary. I remonstrated, but was told that this was normal. The great figures set the boundaries of knowledge, and our task was just to fill in a few details. Another difference, which led to problems until I understood it, was with another Japanese student, whose work in first draft seemed incredibly tentative, thin and superficial, even though I knew the student had done excellent fieldwork. My Western students usually produce a first draft which is very dense and cluttered, and then gradually thin it out. What I found was that my Japanese student first delicately put in some touches, then added more and more, rather like the elaborate process in certain Japanese arts and crafts. Another difference is in the field of logic and language. Dr. Dai Tozumi came to do his PhD in Cambridge and explained to me that in this process he had to learn many ways of thinking which are unfamiliar in Japan. For example, in his thesis, he makes hypothetical statements using phrases like "that would be unlikely to" and "would be able to." He comments that, I quote, "these statements could be translated into Japanese, but are too abstract for most Japanese native speakers to understand. In fact, it is very difficult for them to have a full understanding of an utterance which has nothing to do with the world of experience, since when expressing a given idea, they tend to put it in concrete terms. This is why I had to learn how to make hypothetical statements in English." End of quote. He also had to learn, quote, "how to formulate working hypotheses," end of quote, and how to employ things like the pluperfect or the past perfect. For this, quote, "this tense is utterly alien to most Japanese native speakers, since it does not exist in their indigenous language." End of quote. Thus, in the relations between supervisor and student, and in the logic, aims, and methods of constructing a PhD, great differences exist, and I suspect that there are many wider issues. For example, my Japanese friends who visit Cambridge find its obvious religiosity puzzling. They understand that many rituals are needed, as in their own country, but they express the same astonishment that we find in the early Japanese accounts of encounters with Westerners, who are amazed at the irrationality of the Westerners, so sane in many practical ways, who actually believe all this nonsense about a loving God and his crucified Son. So the way in which religion seeps into poetry, architecture, philosophy, and even science in the West strikes them as odd. Likewise, I have noticed that social relations, the clubbish and collegiate atmosphere of Cambridge, the way one makes networks of friends, the way one reciprocates kindnesses, are all things which it takes a huge effort of learning for Japanese students to acquire. Many fail in this attempt and remain locked up in loneliness, struggling with alien demands and logic. There is a wider implication of all this, which it is worth ending on, which I think Fukuzawa also anticipated. In his thoughts on the different stages of civilization, Fukuzawa largely accepted the popular 19th century evolutionary stage model based on 18th century stage theory. Civilizations could be fitted into ranks, from the most primitive to the most civilized, usually there being 3 or 4 such stages. He described how Japan was trying to catch up and move rapidly from the middling stages to the most civilized. Yet in seeing history as a sort of race, Fukuzawa seems to have kept the option that Japan might catch up and even overtake other civilizations without moving through a set of stages which all civilizations had to go through. His delight at the defeat of China may partly have come from the fact that it showed that one could overtake a great civilization without having to become identical with it. The Japanese did not need to become Chinese in order to overcome China or overtake China. By extension, Japan could become equal, if not superior, to the West without foregoing its identity. This obviously has implications for the major event of the 21st century, that is, the re-emergence of Asia as the center of the world. India, Japan, the Little Tigers, and above all China, are aware that they have much to learn from the West, as did Fukuzawa, not least in terms of organizing good places to generate thought and questioning, namely universities. Yet, in this process, they do not need to uproot the old, which was Chairman Mao's massive mistake. Rather, they can graft on aspects of civilization. Japan's success in doing this, and in the process of not abandoning its integrity, is an encouragement to those in India or China who are wondering if such a thing is possible. And it again reminds us our task is not to iron out difference or to paper it over and pretend that it does not exist. Rather, it is to talk about such differences, celebrate them, and understand what effects they have and the pain that is caused if the difference of paths are not recognized. As our 2 great universities, Keio and Cambridge, celebrate their long existence as centres for free thought and intellectual innovation, it is fit to give tribute to Fukuzawa Yukichi. His portrait hangs near that of his great contemporary across the oceans, F.W. Maitland, with whom I paired him in my book. Maitland, like Fukuzawa, saw deep into the inner essence of civilizations. He described better than anyone else, I believe, the way in which the English tree, a branch of which was taken and replanted in America and then grafted onto the Japanese tree worked. We live in a world where we are told civilizations clash. They do indeed, and the individual moving from one to the other bears the scars. But one of our tasks as intellectuals is surely to rise above this endless friction, movement of tectonic plates, and to make the ignorant armies of the poem less ignorant, and to play more productive games than war. Fukuzawa helped us to see the common task of joining together from our different worlds to solve some of the vast problems which face the human species.